Have you ever felt the weight of a decision that could put everything you've sworn to protect at risk? The meeting hall of the Royal Palace of Ardenton was a study in restrained opulence. Ancient tapestries adorned the dark oak walls, silently telling the story of a kingdom that had survived political storms and wars. The scent of aged leather and polished wood lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle fragrance of fresh roses arranged in crystal vases. Edward Blackwood, the royal financial advisor, sat stiffly in his high-backed chair, his fingers gently drumming on the polished mahogany table. His deep blue eyes, as intense as the North Sea, scanned each face around him with careful scrutiny. At the head of the table sat Lord Ashbury, with his well-trimmed moustache and penetrating gaze. To his right, Lady Amelia, her grey hair elegantly pinned in a bun, maintained a composed expression. "Gentlemen and Lady Amelia," began Lord Ashbury, his grave voice echoing through the room, "we are here to discuss an unprecedented opportunity for the Kingdom of Ardenton." Edward felt a knot form in his stomach. Something about the way Lord Ashbury pronounced opportunity triggered all his instincts of caution. "A new investment proposal has reached us," Ashbury continued, his eyes gleaming with an enthusiasm Edward rarely witnessed. "A chance to multiply the royal treasury on a scale we'd know." Lady Amelia leaned forward, her thin lips curving into an almost imperceptible smile. "It's true, Edward. The numbers are impressive, to say the least." Edward frowned, his mind racing. In his 15 years as a financial advisor, he had learned that opportunities that seemed too good to be true often were exactly that, too good to be true. "May I ask about the details of this investment?" Edward inquired, keeping his tone calm and professional. Lord Ashbury exchanged a quick glance with Lady Amelia before replying, "It's a new company, Edward. Innovative. They have a revolutionary method of extracting natural resources that promises exponential returns." "And the name of this company?" Edward pressed gently. There was a barely perceptible pause before Lady Amelia responded, "Blackstone Trading Company." The name landed like a stone in Edward's stomach. He knew of Blackstone's reputation, rumors of questionable practices, and even more, but to see such respected members of the court championing an investment in it, it was unexpected and deeply unsettling. "I understand your hesitation, Edward," Lord Ashbury spoke, leaning forward. "But think of the possibilities. With this investment, we could fund projects that would benefit the entire kingdom. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure, all within our reach." Edward felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him. They expected his approval, his financial blessing to move forward. The unusual enthusiasm, the rush to approve, the choice of a company with a dubious reputation, all of it triggered alarms in his mind. "I need time to review the figures," Edward finally said, choosing his words carefully. "An investment of this magnitude requires thorough analysis." He saw a flicker of something, disappointment, irritation, flash across Lord Ashbury's face before the older man slowly nodded. "Of course, Edward. Your diligence is one of the reasons we trust you so much. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." As the meeting concluded and the participants rose to leave, Edward remained seated, his gaze fixed on the papers before him, but his mind miles away. An unsettling sensation settled in his chest, the certainty that there was much more to this proposal than appeared on the surface. As the others' footsteps echoed down the corridor, Edward found himself alone in the now silent room. The weight of the decision he would have to make seemed to crush his shoulders. He looked up at the portrait of the king on the wall, the painted eyes seeming to watch him with expectation. "What am I getting myself into?" Edward murmured to himself, the question hanging in the air without an answer. How far would you go to uncover the truth? Night fell over Ardenton, draping the palace in lengthening shadows. Edward remained in his office, the light from a single lamp illuminating the stack of documents before him. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in the silence, reminding him that every second brought him closer to a decision he couldn't put off. His eyes scanned lines of numbers and graphs, searching for something that might explain his superior's unusual enthusiasm. As he delved deeper into the proposed investment's details, a feeling of unease grew in his chest. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, frowning. A slight creak at the door made Edward look up abruptly. Sarah, his trusted assistant, entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, placing the steaming cup beside him. Edward smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Sarah, you're an angel." As Sarah turned to leave, Edward noticed a hesitation in her movements. "Is there something else?" he asked gently. "Mr. Blackwood, I've heard some rumors in the corridors about this new investment." Edward straightened in his chair, his full attention on her. "What kind of rumors?" "Well," Sarah began, lowering her voice, "they say that some important people are very interested in this business, more than usual, and there were mentions of a name, Blackstone." Edward's heart quickened. "What else did you hear about Blackstone?" Sarah shook her head. "Not much, but the way people talked, it seemed they were afraid to even mention the name out loud." Edward nodded slowly, his mind working quickly. "Thank you, Sarah. This is very helpful." After Sarah left, Edward leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. Blackstone Trading Company, a name he knew only in passing, always associated with whispers and furtive glances. Carefully, he removed several volumes, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall. His fingers worked quickly on the mechanism, and soon the door opened with a soft click. From within, Edward retrieved a thin folder, marked simply with the word "Confidential." He opened it on his desk, revealing old documents and yellowed newspaper clippings. As he read, his face paled. Blackstone was not just a company of questionable reputation, it was an entity with deep, dark ties to figures known for their opposition to the monarchy. One name in particular leapt off the page, causing Edward to catch his breath. Lord Hawke. "It can't be," he whispered, feeling a chill run down his spine. Lord Hawke, once a respected noble, had been exiled decades ago after a scandal that nearly tore the kingdom apart. Rumors of treason, conspiracies, and coup attempts had surrounded his fall, and now here was his name, subtly linked to Blackstone in a document dated just a few months prior. Edward felt the weight of the discovery settle over him. If Lord Hawke was somehow involved, this meant the proposed investment was not only a financial risk, it was a potential threat to the very stability of the kingdom. But how could he prove it? How could he alert the others without appearing paranoid or worse, disloyal? A sudden noise in the hallway made Edward jump. Quickly, he returned the documents to the safe, his heart pounding in his chest. As he closed the bookshelf, he couldn't help but wonder, was he being watched? Who else in the palace might be involved in this scheme? Edward returned to his desk, the cup of tea now cold and forgotten. He looked at the window, seeing his own reflection overlaid on the darkness outside. The question echoed in his mind. How far would you go to uncover the truth? And what would be the cost of that pursuit? With a deep sigh, Edward picked up a blank sheet of paper and began to write. If he was to dive into this investigation, he would need to be methodical, careful, and above all, discreet. The future of Ardenton could very well depend on his next actions. As the night wore on, Edward worked tirelessly, connecting dots, formulating theories, and mapping out a plan. He knew he was entering dangerous waters, but the alternative, standing by while a threat unfolded under his nose, was unthinkable. The clock struck midnight, and Edward finally leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and with it, the true beginning of his search for the truth. A search he feared could change everything. What if the danger lay not only in the present but buried in the past? Have you ever felt the weight of a decision that could put everything you've sworn to protect at risk? The meeting hall of the Royal Palace in Ardenton was a study in restrained opulence. Centuries-old tapestries adorned the dark oak walls, silently recounting the story of a kingdom that had withstood political storms and wars. The scent of aged leather and polished wood lingered in the air, blending with the subtle fragrance of fresh roses arranged in crystal vases. Edward Blackwood, the royal financial advisor, sat stiffly in his high-backed chair, his fingers tapping softly on the polished mahogany table. His deep blue eyes, as intense as the North Sea, carefully studied the faces around him. Lord Ashbury, with his well-groomed moustache and piercing gaze, occupied the head of the table. To his right, Lady Amelia, her grey hair elegantly pinned in a bun, held a composed expression. "Gentlemen, and Lady Amelia," Lord Ashbury began, his deep voice echoing in the room, "we are here to discuss an unprecedented opportunity for the Kingdom of Ardenton." Edward felt a knot forming in his stomach. Something in Lord Ashbury's tone as he said opportunity triggered all his cautionary instincts. "A new investment proposal has reached us," Ashbury continued, his eyes gleaming with an enthusiasm Edward rarely saw. "A chance to multiply the royal treasury on a scale we'd never thought possible." Lady Amelia leaned forward, her thin lips curving into an almost imperceptible smile. "It's true, Edward. The numbers are impressive, to say the least." Edward frowned, his mind racing. In his 15 years as a financial advisor, he had learned that opportunities that seemed too good to be true often were exactly that, too good to be true. "May I ask for the details of this investment?" Edward inquired, keeping his tone calm and professional. Lord Ashbury exchanged a quick glance with Lady Amelia before replying, "It's a new company, Edward. Innovative. They have a revolutionary method of extracting natural resources that promises exponential returns." "And the name of this company?" Edward pressed gently. There was a barely perceptible pause before Lady Amelia answered. "Blackstone Trading Company." The name fell like a stone in Edward's stomach. He knew Blackstone's reputation, whispers of questionable practices and alliances that were even more questionable. But to see such respected members of the court advocating an investment in it, this was unexpected and deeply unsettling. "I understand your hesitation, Edward," Lord Ashbury spoke. "With this investment, we could fund projects that would benefit the entire kingdom. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure, all within our reach." Edward felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him. They expected his approval, his financial blessing to proceed. But something was wrong. The unusual enthusiasm, the rush to approve, the choice of a company with a dubious reputation, all of it made alarm bells go off in his mind. "I need time to review the figures," Edward said finally, choosing his word. "An investment of this magnitude requires thorough analysis." He saw a flicker of something. Disappointment? Irritation? Crossed Lord Ashbury's face before the older man nodded slowly. "Of course, Edward. Your diligence is one of the reasons we trust you so much. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." As the meeting ended and the attendees rose to leave, Edward remained seated, his gaze fixed on the papers before him, but his mind miles away. An unsettling sensation settled in his chest, the certainty that there was much more to this proposal than met the eye. As the others' footsteps echoed down the corridor, Edward found himself alone in the now silent room. The weight of the decision he would have to make seemed to press on his shoulders. He looked up at the portrait of the king on the wall, the painted eyes seeming to watch him with expectation. "What am I getting myself into?" Edward murmured to himself, the question hanging in the air unanswered. How far would you go to uncover the truth? Night fell over Ardenton, draping the palace in long shadows. Edward remained in his office, the light of a single lamp illuminating the stack of documents before him. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in the silence, reminding him that each second brought him closer to a decision he couldn't delay. His eyes scanned the lines of numbers and graphs, searching for something to explain his superior's unusual enthusiasm. As he delved deeper into the proposed investment's details, a feeling of unease grew in his chest. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, frowning. A slight creak at the door made Edward look up abruptly. Sarah, his trusted assistant, entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, placing the steaming cup beside him. Edward smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Sarah, you're an angel." As Sarah turned to leave, Edward noticed a hesitation in her movements. "Is there something else?" he asked gently. Sarah bit her lip, clearly conflicted. "Mr. Blackwood, I've heard some rumors in the corridors about this new investment." Edward straightened in his chair, his full attention on her. "What kind of rumors?" "Well," Sarah began, lowering her voice, They say that some important people are very interested in this business. And there were mentions of a name, Blackstone. Edward's heart quickened. What else did you hear about Blackstone? Sarah shook her head. Not much, but the way people talked, it seemed they were afraid to even mention the name out loud. Edward nodded slowly, his mind working quickly. Thank you, Sarah. This is very helpful. After Sarah left, Edward leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. Blackstone Trading Company, a name he knew only in passing, always associated with whispers and furtive glances. Determined, Edward rose and walked to a bookshelf in the corner of his office. Carefully, he removed several volumes, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall. His fingers worked quickly on the mechanism, and soon the door opened with a soft click. From within, Edward retrieved a thin folder, marked simply with the word confidential. He opened it on his desk, revealing old documents and yellowed newspaper C. As he read, his face paled. Blackstone was not just a company of questionable reputation. It was an entity with deep, dark ties to figures known for their opposition to the monarchy. One name in particular leapt off the page, causing Edward to catch his breath. Lord Hawke. It can't be, he whispered, feeling a chill run down his spine. Lord Hawke, once a respected noble, had been exiled decades ago after a scandal that nearly tore the kingdom apart. Rumors of treason, conspiracies, and coup attempts had surrounded his fall. And now here was his name, subtly linked to Blackstone in a document dated just a few months prior. Edward felt the weight of the discovery settle over him. If Lord Hawke was somehow involved, this meant the proposed investment was not only a financial risk, it was a potential threat to the very stability of the kingdom. But how could he prove it? How could he alert the others without appearing paranoid or worse, disloyal? A sudden noise in the hallway made Edward jump. Quickly, he returned the documents to the safe, his heart pounding in his chest. As he closed the bookshelf, he couldn't help but wonder, was he being watched? Who else in the palace might be involved in this scheme? Edward returned to his desk, the cup of tea now cold and forgotten. He looked at the window, seeing his own reflection overlaid on the darkness outside. The question echoed in his mind. How far would you go to uncover the truth? And what would be the cost of that pursuit? With a deep sigh, Edward picked up a blank sheet of paper and began to write. If he was to dive into this investigation, he would need to be methodical, careful, and above all, discreet. The future of Ardenton could very well depend on his next actions. As the night wore on, Edward worked tirelessly, connecting dots, formulating theories, and mapping out a plan. He knew he was entering dangerous waters, but the alternative, standing by while a threat unfolded under his nose, was unthinkable. The clock struck midnight, and Edward finally leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and with it, the true beginning of his search for the truth. A search he feared could change everything. What if the danger lay not only in the present, but buried in the past? The morning sun cast a thin layer of mist over Ardenton's palace gardens, as though nature itself was trying to conceal the secrets Edward had unearthed the night before. He walked through the quiet corridors, his footsteps echoing softly against the old stone walls. His destination was the Royal Library, a vast repository of knowledge spanning centuries of Ardenton's history. The huge oak doors creaked slightly as they opened, revealing endless rows of shelves stretching up to the vaulted ceiling. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," greeted a gentle voice. Martha, the head archivist, emerged from behind a stack of books, her glasses reflecting the soft light streaming through the high windows. Edward forced a smile, trying to mask the anxiety gnawing at him. "Good morning, Martha. I hope I'm not disturbing you this early." Martha shook her head, a gentle smile on her lips. "Not at all. What can I do for you today?" Edward hesitated for a moment, carefully weighing his words. "I'm doing some research on Ardenton's recent economic history. Specifically, I'm interested in any information regarding Lord Hawke and his commercial enterprises." Martha's smile faltered briefly, a shadow passing across her eyes. "Lord Hawke? That's a name I haven't heard in quite some time." Edward watched her reaction closely. "Yes, I imagine so. But for a complete analysis, I need to understand all aspects of our economic history, even the more controversial ones. Martha nodded slowly, her eyes studying Edward with an intensity that surprised him. I understand. Well, most official records about Lord Hawke were, let's say, specially archived after his exile, but I may be able to help you locate some relevant information. She guided him through a labyrinth of shelves to an isolated section at the back of the library. The air there felt heavier, laden with the weight of secrets long kept. Here, Martha said, pulling out a large, leather-bound book. This is a financial ledger from that time. It doesn't mention Hawke directly, but if you read between the lines... Edward took the book, feeling the weight of history in his hands. As he leafed through the yellowed pages, his eyes caught familiar patterns. Suspicious transactions, shell companies, fund movements that didn't make sense at first glance. "This is enlightening," he murmured, more to himself than to Martha. The archivist was watching him closely. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "I should warn you. Investigating Lord Hawke's past, well, let's say not everyone in the palace would be pleased with it." Edward looked up from the book, meeting her concerned gaze. "You know something more, don't you?" Martha hesitated, glancing nervously around before leaning in closer. "There are rumors, whispers really, that Hawke never actually that he still has allies here in positions of power." Edward's heart quickened. This confirmed his suspicions, but also exponentially increased the danger of his investigation. "Martha," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I need your help. If there's more information about Hawke, about his current connections..." The archivist cut him off with a gesture. "Say no more. I may have access to certain files that aren't in the official catalogue. But Edward," she grasped his arm, her eyes intense, "you must be careful, very careful." Edward nodded solemnly. "I understand, and thank you for your warning and your help." In the hours that followed, Edward plunged into a sea of documents, connecting dots that had remained separate for decades. The image that emerged was disturbing, a complex web of influence and manipulation stretching from the shadows of the past into the present. When he finally emerged from the library, the sun was already setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and red. Edward carried with him not only precious notes, but also a weight on his chest, the knowledge that the threat he faced was far bigger and more deeply rooted than he had ever imagined. As he walked back to his office, every shadow seemed to hide a potential enemy, every whisper in the corridors a possible conspiracy. Edward knew he had crossed a point of no return. The past, with all its secrets and dangers, had resurfaced, and now it was up to him to decide how to confront it. With his hand on the doorknob of his office, Edward paused, the question echoing in his mind. What if the danger lay not only in the present, but buried in the past? He knew that the answer to that question could very well determine the future of Ardenton, and perhaps even his own survival. Who would you protect? Those you swore allegiance to, or your own life? Edward's office, once a haven of tranquility, now felt stifling. The walls, lined with dark wood paneling, seemed to close in on him as he contemplated the discoveries of the day. The ticking of the clock sounded like a countdown to a decision he could no longer avoid. Sitting at his desk, Edward spread out the notes he had made in the library. Each piece of paper contained a fragment of the puzzle he was trying to assemble. Names, dates, financial transactions, all pointing to a web of intrigue that extended far beyond what he initially suspected. A sudden knock on the door made him jump. Quickly, he covered his notes with other papers before saying, "Come in." Lord Ashbury entered, his imposing presence filling the office. "Edward, my dear fellow, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, my lord," Edward replied, rising from his chair. "How can I help you?" Ashbury stepped closer, his eyes roaming over Edward's desk with an interest that made the advisor feel uneasy. "I came to check on the progress of your analysis on the Blackstone investment. I assume you've come to a conclusion?" Edward felt his heart race. This was the moment of truth. He could easily approve the investment, protect his position, and avoid any conflict. But the evidence he had uncovered weighed heavily on his conscience. "My lord," Edward began carefully, choosing his words, After a thorough analysis, I have some concerns about this investment. Ashbury's smile faltered for a moment. Concerns? Of what kind exactly? Edward took a deep breath. The numbers don't seem consistent, and there are issues regarding Blackstone's reputation that I cannot ignore. I feel it would be irresponsible to recommend this investment without further investigation. The silence that followed was thick. Ashbury stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of studied calm. I understand your caution, Edward. It's one of the reasons you're so valuable to the Crown. But perhaps you're being overly cautious in this case. With all due respect, my lord, Edward responded, feeling a surge of courage he hadn't known he possessed. I believe my duty is to protect the kingdom's financial interests, even if it means going against expectations. Ashbury leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a near threat. And if I were to tell you that there is more at stake here than just finances, that approving this investment is crucial for greater interests of the kingdom? Edward felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of interests, my lord? The kind that isn't discussed openly, my dear Edward, Ashbury replied, straightening up. Trust me when I say it's better for everyone if this investment goes through without further questions. In that moment, Edward saw clearly the crossroads before him. On one side, the safe path, approve the investment, keep his position, perhaps even gain favor. On the other, an uncertain and potentially dangerous path, but aligned with his conscience and duty. I need more time, Edward finally said, to ensure I'm making the right decision for Ardenton. Ashbury studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Very well, but don't take too long, Edward. There are forces in motion that wait for no one. As Ashbury left, closing the door behind him, Edward sank into his chair, feeling the weight of every unspoken word. He knew he had just taken the first step down a dangerous path. Looking up at the king's portrait on the wall, Edward wondered, to whom did he owe his true loyalty? The crown he swore to serve, the superiors who demanded his obedience, or the truth he had uncovered, as inconvenient and dangerous as it was? Night was falling over Ardenton, and with it the certainty that the days ahead would be decisive not only for Edward, but for the kingdom's future. As shadows lengthened in his office, he began to map out his next move, knowing that every step would take him deeper into a game where the stakes were too high to ignore. The question echoed in his mind. Who would you protect? Those you swore allegiance to, or your own life? Edward knew that his answer to that question would define not only his destiny, but perhaps the fate of all of Ardenton. What if, in your quest for truth, you discover that betrayal lies where you least expect it? The following morning dawned grey and damp, as if the sky itself mirrored Edward's inner turmoil. He walked the palace corridors with cautious steps, every shadow seeming to hide a potential enemy. His destination was the Royal Archives, a maze of shelves and drawers holding centuries of Ardenton's history. Edward knew he needed more information, more proof, before he could act against the threat he had uncovered. Turning a corner, he almost collided with Martha, the archivist who had helped him the previous day. Her eyes widened in surprise at seeing him. Mr. Blackwood, she whispered, glancing nervously around, I was just about to look for you. I found something you need to see. Edward's heart raced. Not here, he murmured. My office in an hour. Martha nodded quickly before slipping away down a side corridor. Edward continued on his way, his mind whirling with possibilities. An hour later, a soft knock on his office door announced Martha's arrival. She entered swiftly, carrying a thin folder under her arm. Lock the door, Edward instructed, rising from his chair. Martha complied before approaching the desk. What I found is dangerous, Mr. Blackwood. Very dangerous. She opened the folder, revealing old documents and faded photographs. These are unofficial records from the time of Lord Hawke's exile. They were deliberately hidden, but let's just say I have my methods. Edward examined the documents, his face paling as he absorbed the information. This changes everything. The papers revealed a plot far deeper than Edward had imagined. Lord Hawke had not only maintained contacts within Ardenton after his exile, but he had built a network of allies in key positions in the government and nobility. "But why?" Edward muttered, more to himself than to Martha. "Why risk everything with this investment now?" Martha hesitated before answering. "There are rumors, whispers really, that the king's health is worse than the public knows. If that's true, then this investment could be part of a larger plan," Edward concluded, the realization hitting him like a blow. An attempt to gain financial control at a time of potential political instability. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of the conspiracy they had uncovered. "Mr. Blackwood," Martha said finally, her voice trembling, "what do we do now?" Edward stood, walking to the window. Outside, life in the palace continued as usual, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. "We need more allies," he said slowly, "people we can trust. But how do we know who's on our side and who might be working for Hawke?" At that moment, as if answering his question, there was a loud knock on the door. Edward and Martha exchanged alarmed looks. "Quick, hide the documents," Edward whispered urgently. As Martha hurriedly stashed the papers back into her folder, Edward went to the door, trying to keep his composure. Opening it, he found himself face to face with Charles, a young noble who worked as Lord Ashbury's assistant. "Edward," Charles said, his tone urgent, "Lord Ashbury requests your presence immediately. He says it's about the Blackstone investment." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. Had they discovered his investigation? He cast a quick look at Martha, who stood motionless by the bookshelf. "Of course," Edward replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'll be there shortly." When Charles left, Edward turned to Martha. "I need you to keep these documents in a safe place. Trust no one but me." Martha nodded, her eyes reflecting the same fear that Edward felt. "Be careful, Mr. Blackwood. We don't know who our true allies are." As Edward prepared to leave, the question echoed in his mind. What if, in your quest for truth, you discover that betrayal lies where you least expect it? He knew that every step from this moment on would be like walking through a minefield. One false move could cost him not only his career, but potentially his life and the future of Ardenton. With one last look at Martha, Edward left his office, ready to face whatever Lord Ashbury had in store for him, fully aware that the political chess game he had entered was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Could the kingdom be on the brink of a coup, or is this threat merely a shadow from the past? Lord Ashbury's office was a monument to opulence and power. Persian rugs covered the polished wooden floor, while the walls bore portraits of noble ancestors and ancient maps of the kingdom. Edward felt the weight of centuries of history and political intrigue as he crossed the threshold. Lord Ashbury stood by the window, his back turned to the door. At the sound of Edward's steps, he slowly turned around, his face a mask of studied calm. "Ah, Edward," said Ashbury, his voice smooth but with an edge beneath it. "Thank you for coming so promptly." Edward inclined his head in a respectful gesture. "Lord Ashbury, I understand you wish to discuss the Blackstone investment." "Yes, indeed." Ashbury gestured for Edward to sit, taking his own seat behind the imposing oak desk. "I've noticed your hesitation in approving this deal. I must confess I'm intrigued by your reasons." Edward felt his heart hammering but maintained his composure. "As I mentioned before, my lord, I have concerns about the financial viability and reputation of the company." Ashbury leaned forward, his penetrating gaze fixed on Edward. "And those are your only concerns? There's nothing else troubling you about this investment?" The air in the room seemed to grow denser. Edward knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Every word now could be a trap. "My lord," Edward began carefully, "as the financial advisor to the Crown, it is my duty to consider all aspects of an investment of this magnitude. If there is anything else I should know, anything that might affect my decision or the kingdom's well-being, I would be grateful for any additional information." A thin smile crept across Ashbury's lips. "Very diplomatic, Edward, but allow me to be direct. You've been investigating beyond the scope of your usual responsibilities, haven't you?" Edward felt a chill run down his spine. They knew. Somehow, his investigations hadn't gone unnoticed. Edward hesitated, searching for the right words. "I merely seek to fully understand the implications of this investment for Ardenton." Ashbury rose abruptly, walking over to a painting on the wall. With a smooth motion, he swung it aside, revealing a safe embedded behind it. "You know, Edward, there are things about how this kingdom operates that few comprehend. Decisions that must be made for the greater good, even if they appear questionable at first." He opened the safe and removed a thick folder. "What I'm about to show you is of the highest confidentiality. Your reaction to this information will determine much about your future and Ardenton's." With trembling hands, Edward took the folder Ashbury handed him. Opening it, his eyes widened in shock. Before him lay detailed documents about a vast network of influence and power extending far beyond Ardenton's borders. At the center of it all, a name that made his blood run cold: Lord Hawke. "As you can see," Ashbury continued, his voice now laden with a somber gravity, "the situation is much more complex than it appears. Lord Hawke is not merely an exiled enemy. He's become a key player in a much larger game." Edward skimmed through the documents, his mind struggling to process the implications. This is a conspiracy on a global scale. But why? What's the ultimate goal? Ashbury perched on the edge of his desk, looking at Edward intently. "The world is changing, my dear fellow. Monarchies like ours are becoming relics of a distant past. This investment, this alliance with Hawke, is our chance to ensure Ardenton not only survives, but thrives in this new age." "But at what cost?" Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. "Our integrity, our independence?" "At whatever cost is necessary," Ashbury replied firmly. "The question now, Edward, is, are you with us or against us?" The silence that followed was deafening. Edward looked again at the documents in his hands, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that his next word could seal not only his fate, but potentially that of the entire kingdom. Could the kingdom be on the brink of a coup, or is this threat merely a shadow from the past? The question echoed in his mind as he faced Lord Ashbury, fully aware that his response would shape the course of the events to come. With a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil, Edward prepared to give his answer, knowing that regardless of his choice, nothing in Ardenton would ever be the same after this moment. "How far would you risk yourself to save what you love?" The silence in Lord Ashbury's office was almost palpable, laden with the weight of revelation and expectation. Edward felt Ashbury's piercing gaze on him, waiting for his response. His heart pounded furiously in his chest, each beat echoing the gravity of the situation. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was a newfound determination in his gaze. "Lord Ashbury," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "I swore loyalty to the Crown and to the people of Ardenton, not to individuals or to obscure interests." Ashbury tilted his head, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "And you believe that loyalty conflicts with what I've shown you?" "I believe we stand on a dangerous precipice," Edward replied, choosing his words carefully. "The changes you propose, this alliance with Hawke, they could very well destroy the essence of what makes Ardenton what it is." "You're an idealist, Edward," Ashbury said, his tone now tinged with condescension. "The world isn't black and white. Sometimes we must make concessions to survive." Edward stood, meeting Ashbury's gaze head-on. "Survival at what cost? If we forsake our principles, what are we defending?" For a moment, something like admiration flickered in Ashbury's eyes. "You have courage, I'll admit, but courage without wisdom can be dangerous. And wisdom without morals is mere manipulation," Edward retorted. The air between them crackled with tension. Ashbury circled the desk slowly, his gaze never leaving Edward. "You do understand the implications of your stance, don't you?" Ashbury asked, his voice low and "What will happen if you oppose this?" Edward felt a chill down his spine but remained firm. "I understand perfectly, but I cannot, in good conscience, support something I believe will harm the kingdom I swore to protect." Ashbury sighed heavily, as if he bore the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I had hoped you would be more flexible, Edward, more understanding of the kingdom's needs. The true needs of the kingdom," Edward emphasized, "are not served by secret deals and shadowy alliances." A tense silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Ashbury spoke, his voice carrying an undercurrent of veiled threat. "You have 24 hours, Edward. 24 hours to reconsider your position and approve the Blackstone investment. Otherwise—" He left the sentence hanging, the unspoken words more menacing than any he could have said. Edward nodded slowly, fully grasping the gravity of the situation. "I understand, my lord. If you'll excuse me." As he turned to leave, Edward felt the weight of Ashbury's gaze on his back. He knew that as he stepped out of that office, he was stepping into a new world, one fraught with danger, intrigue, and potentially fatal consequences. In the corridor, away from Ashbury's watchful eyes, Edward allowed himself a moment of weakness, leaning against the cold stone wall. His mind raced with the implications of what had just transpired. He had 24 hours to act, to try to save Ardenton from the fate that Ashbury and his allies had planned. The question echoed in his mind. How far would you risk yourself to save what you love? He knew that his answer to that question would determine not only his fate, but the future of the entire kingdom. With renewed determination, he straightened and began to walk quickly through the ancestral corridors of Ardenton. He had allies to contact, evidence to gather, and a plan to formulate. Time was running out, and Edward knew that every second counted. As he moved purposefully through Ardenton's ancient halls, Edward felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He was about to take the most important and dangerous step of his life, a step that could alter the course of the kingdom forever. The sun began to set over Ardenton, casting long shadows through the palace corridors. Edward knew that the coming night would be the longest of his life, and that dawn would bring with it a new chapter in the kingdom's history, a chapter he was determined to write with courage, integrity, and love for Ardenton. Who would you trust with the truth, when every shadow might conceal a traitor? Night fell over Ardenton, cloaking the palace in a shroud of darkness that seemed to mirror the gravity of the situation. Edward moved quietly through the corridors, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. His destination, Martha's quarters, the archivist. Arriving at the door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking 3 times in a specific pattern, a code they had established earlier. Seconds later, the door opened, revealing Martha's worried face. "Come in quickly," she whispered, pulling him inside. The small room was lit only by a few candles, creating an intimate and secretive atmosphere. Edward noticed immediately that they were not alone. Seated in a chair in the corner was Charles, Lord Ashbury's young assistant, his face a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Charles?" Edward exclaimed, surprised. "What are you doing here?" The young man rose, his gaze steady as it. "I'm here to help, Mr. Blackwood. I can no longer stay silent in the face of what's happening." Edward looked from Charles to Martha, seeking confirmation. The archivist nodded slowly. "We can trust him, Edward. Charles has been my eyes and ears in Ashbury's inner circles." A cautious relief washed over Edward. Allies were precious at this moment, but trust was a dangerous luxury. "Very well," said Edward, taking a seat at the small table in the center of the room. "We don't have much time. Ashbury gave me an ultimatum, 24 hours to approve the Blackstone investment or face the consequences." Martha gasped, covering her mouth. "Then they know you've discovered something." Charles leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "It's worse than we imagined, Mr. Blackwood. Ashbury and Hawke's plan isn't just about financial control. They intend to use the ensuing economic chaos to justify a change in leadership. A coup," Edward concluded, feeling a cold. Martha quickly moved to a shelf, pulling out a false book to reveal a hidden compartment. From it, she retrieved a thin folder. "These are the documents I found, Edward. Along with what Charles has brought, we have enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy." Edward examined the papers, his mind racing. But who can we take this to? Who in the palace hasn't been compromised by Ashbury and Hawke? A heavy silence fell over the room as they all contemplated the gravity of the situation. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice trembling but resolute. "There is one person, Princess Eleanor. She is outside Ashbury's inner circle and has a reputation for unwavering integrity." Edward considered this for a moment. Princess Eleanor, the king's younger sister, was known for her political acumen and her love for the people of Ardenton. If anyone could help them expose the conspiracy without destabilizing the kingdom, it would be her. "It's risky," said Edward slowly, "but it might be our best chance. Charles, can you arrange a meeting with the princess without raising suspicion?" The young man nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "I'll try. I have some contacts in the royal wing who can help." "Excellent," Edward replied, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. "Martha, I need you to organize these documents clearly and concisely. We'll only have one chance to convince the princess." As the three of them worked feverishly, organizing documents and devising a plan, Edward couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. Every decision, every movement now could mean the difference between saving Ardenton or watching it fall into the hands of conspirators. The hours passed quickly, and soon the first rays of the sun began to filter through the curtains. Edward looked at his allies, tired but determined. "Remember," he said softly, as they prepared to leave for the arranged meeting spot, "each step we take now is crucial. Trust only one another and Princess Eleanor. The future of Ardenton depends on us." As the three left the room, ready to face the decisive day ahead, Edward's question echoed in his mind. Who would you trust with the truth when every shadow could conceal a traitor? He knew that the answer to that question would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of the entire kingdom. How do you convince someone of the unthinkable when time is running out? The morning sun barely touched the highest towers of the palace when Edward, Martha, and Charles split up, each with their crucial task. Edward returned to his office, keeping up appearances while anxiously awaiting word from Charles. The hours dragged by like days. Edward forced himself to review routine documents, his mind constantly drifting back to the imminent danger hanging over Ardenton. Every knock on his door made his heart race, fearing it was Ashbury or one of his allies coming to demand his decision. Finally, shortly after midday, a coded message arrived from Charles. "The Eagle will receive the messenger at sunset." Edward felt a wave of both relief and apprehension. Princess Eleanor had agreed to meet them, but they would have only one chance to persuade her. The following hours were a whirlwind of discreet preparations. Edward and Martha meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence, ensuring that their presentation would be irrefutable. Meanwhile, Charles arranged a secure route to the secret meeting location. As the sun began to set, painting the sky over Ardenton with shades of orange and purple, the three met in a rarely used hallway in the back of the palace. Martha carried a discreet folder containing the vital documents, while Edward and Charles kept a wary eye out for any sign they'd been followed. "Remember," Edward whispered to his allies as they approached the royal quarters, "stay calm no matter what happens. Confidence is our best weapon now." They were met by one of the princess's handmaidens, who guided them silently through a series of narrow passages until they reached a small private study. There, seated in an elegant armchair, was Princess Eleanor. She was an imposing figure, even in informal attire. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, examined the three visitors with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Well, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I understand you have something of extreme importance to share with me, something that could not wait for official channels." Edward stepped forward, bowing respectfully. "Your Highness, I am deeply grateful for your time. What we have to share is indeed of the utmost importance and urgency." He gestured for Martha, who handed the folder to the princess. As Eleanor began to examine the documents, Edward launched into his explanation, his voice low and intense. "Your Highness, we have uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that threatens not only Ardenton's financial stability, but the very structure of our monarchy." In the minutes that followed, Edward, with occasional input from Martha and Charles, detailed the plot they had uncovered. Princess Eleanor listened in silence, her face a mask of concentration as she absorbed the shocking information. When Edward finished, a heavy silence settled over the room. The princess slowly closed the folder, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "These are very serious accusations, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally. "To accuse Lord Ashbury and suggest Lord Hawke's involvement, this could shake the very foundations of our kingdom." Edward felt his heart clench. Did she not believe them? "Your Highness," he said, leaning forward, "I understand the gravity of what we are presenting, but the danger of inaction is even greater. If this conspiracy succeeds, Ardenton as we know it will cease to exist." Princess Eleanor stood and walked to the window. For long moments she stood there, looking out over the city below. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood," she finally said, turning to face them, "what do you suggest we do?" Edward exchanged quick glances with Martha and Charles before responding. "We need to act quickly and discreetly. First, prevent Blackstone's investment from going forward. Then initiate a secret investigation to expose the entire network of conspirators without causing public panic." The princess nodded slowly. "And you're willing to risk everything? Your career, your reputation, possibly your life, for this?" "Yes, Your Highness," Edward replied without hesitation, "because what is at stake is far greater than any one of us." A slight smile played across the princess's lips. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood, you've convinced me. We will act, and may the heavens help us." As the princess began to outline a plan of action, Edward felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had taken the first crucial step, but the path ahead was still fraught with danger. The question echoed in his mind: how do you convince someone of the unthinkable when time is running out? They had succeeded, but now they faced an even greater challenge: saving Ardenton before it was too late. When danger lurks around every corner, how do you stay calm to face the approaching storm? The morning sun rose over Ardenton, casting its soft colors in stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. Edward, having slept only a few hours, found himself in his office once more, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and strategies. The plan devised with Princess Eleanor was bold and dangerous. They needed to act quickly but with extreme caution. One wrong step could not only ruin their efforts but potentially trigger the very coup they were trying to prevent. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Martha, her face pale with worry. "Edward," she whispered, closing the door behind her, "Lord Ashbury is calling an emergency meeting of the Financial Council. In 1 hour." Edward's heart raced. This could only mean one thing. Ashbury was ready to push through Blackstone's approval by force. "I see," Edward replied, his voice calm despite the storm within. "It's time to put our plan into action. Did you manage to do what we asked?" Martha nodded, discreetly handing him a small device. "Everything is set." Princess Eleanor ensured that the signal would reach the right people at the right time. Edward pocketed the device, feeling the weight of responsibility. "And Charles?" "He's in position," Martha confirmed. "He has the documents ready to distribute as soon as we receive the signal." Edward stood, adjusting his suit. "Well then, this is it. There's no turning back now." As they walked together towards the council chamber, Edward couldn't help but notice how strangely normal everything seemed. Palace staff went about their business, entirely unaware of the drama about to unfold. Reaching the antechamber, they found Charles, who cast a meaningful look in their direction. Everything was in place. "Remember," Edward murmured to his allies, "stay calm, no matter what happens." The doors of the council chamber opened, and Edward entered, feeling the weight of all eyes upon him. Lord Ashbury was at the center of the table, his face a mask of confidence and authority. "Ah, Edward," Ashbury said, a cold smile on his lips. "So glad you could join us. I trust you have come to a wise decision regarding our investment." Edward took his place at the table, fully aware that every move he made was being scrutinized. "Certainly, Lord Ashbury. I am ready to present my analysis to the council." As the meeting began, Edward felt the device in his pocket like a physical weight. He knew the timing of its activation would be crucial. Too soon, and they would lose the element of surprise. Too late, and Ashbury might force the approval before they could intervene. As Ashbury began his presentation, extolling the benefits of Blackstone's investment, Edward carefully observed the other council members. Who among them was aware of the true nature of this deal? Who were the innocent deceived, and who were the willing accomplices? The moment of truth approached. Edward felt an odd calmness settle over him, the clarity that comes when standing in the eye of the storm. When Ashbury finally turned to him, asking for his final approval, Edward rose slowly. His gaze swept the room, briefly meeting the eyes of Martha and Charles at the edges. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," Edward began, his voice firm and clear, "before we give our approval to this investment, there are crucial facts that must be considered." He saw Ashbury's face harden, a flicker of alarm in his eyes. It was now or never. With a discreet movement, Edward activated the device in his pocket. Somewhere in the palace, silent alarms were sounding, setting off a chain of events that would change Ardenton forever. The storm was about to break, and Edward was at its center. The question echoed in his mind. When danger lurks around every corner, how do you stay calm to face the approaching storm? He was about to find out the answer. When the truth is revealed, who will stand firm and who will fall? The silence that followed Edward's words was almost tangible. Every eye in the council room was fixed on him, a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and in some cases outright fear. Lord Ashbury was the first to recover, his face a mask of forced calm. "Edward, my dear fellow, surely any concerns you may have can be discussed privately after we approve this critical investment." Edward held his ground, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm afraid, Lord Ashbury, that what I have to say cannot wait. This investment is not what it seems, and I have proof of a conspiracy that threatens not only our finances, but the stability of Ardenton itself." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Edward saw some council members exchange nervous glances, while others appeared genuinely taken aback. At that moment, the doors to the council room opened abruptly. Princess Eleanor entered, followed by a small team of royal guards. Her face was grave but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of royal authority, "I ask that you remain seated. We are here to investigate very serious allegations of treason and conspiracy." Chaos erupted in the room. Some councillors stood up in protest, while others seemed frozen in shock. Lord Ashbury, his face now livid with anger, pointed an accusatory finger at Edward. "This is an outrage," he shouted. "A desperate attempt by a disgruntled official to sabotage a venture vital to the kingdom." Princess Eleanor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Lord Ashbury, I suggest you choose your next words carefully. We have substantial evidence suggesting your involvement in a plot to destabilize Ardenton's government." Meanwhile, Charles and Martha entered the room, each carrying stacks of documents. They began distributing them to the astonished council members. Edward took a step forward. "What you have in your hands is evidence of a complex network of corruption and treason involving not only the Blackstone investment, but a broader plot to seize control of Ardenton." The councillors' eyes scanned the pages, shock and disbelief spreading across their faces. Lord Ashbury, realizing his position was rapidly deteriorating, made one last desperate attempt. "This is a fabrication, a conspiracy against me and against the progress of our kingdom." It was at that moment that one of the guards approached, whispering something into Princess Eleanor's ear. She nodded gravely before addressing the room once again. "We have just received confirmation. Lord Hawke was apprehended attempting to enter Ardenton in secret. The evidence found with him corroborates everything Mr. Blackwood has presented." A stunned silence fell over the room. Lord Ashbury, his bravado now gone, slumped in his chair, his face a picture of defeat. Princess Eleanor continued, her voice firm. "From this moment, I hereby declare the Royal Council temporarily dissolved, pending a full investigation. Lord Ashbury and all those suspected of involvement in this conspiracy will be detained for questioning." As the guards began escorting Ashbury and several other council members out of the room, Edward felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. They had succeeded in exposing the truth, but the road ahead was still filled with uncertainties. Princess Eleanor approached Edward, Martha, and Charles. "You three have shown extraordinary courage and loyalty. Ardenton owes you a great debt." Edward bowed respectfully. "We only did our duty, Your Highness. The real work of rebuilding trust and stability for our kingdom is just beginning." As the room gradually emptied, leaving behind the echo of shocking revelations and altered fates, Edward could not help but reflect on the question that had haunted him throughout this ordeal. When the truth is revealed, who will stand firm and who will fall? The answer, he realized, was complex and still unfolding. The future of Ardenton had been irreversibly altered, and the true test of its character and institutions was only just beginning. How do you rebuild a kingdom shaken by betrayal and doubt? In the weeks that followed the dramatic council meeting, Ardenton was shaken by a series of seismic changes. The palace, once a bastion of tradition and stability, had become the epicenter of a quiet revolution. Edward, now appointed interim chief advisor by Princess Eleanor, found himself at the heart of a whirlwind of activity. His office, once a quiet retreat, had transformed into a hub of planning and strategy. On a particularly busy morning, Edward met with Martha and Charles, both of whom had been promoted to trusted positions in the new administration. "The interrogations continue," Charles reported, flipping through a stack of documents. "New names emerge every day. Ashbury and Hawke's network was more extensive than we had ever suspected." Martha nodded gravely. "And it's not just in the palace. We've found connections in nearly every sector of government, and even in some of the kingdom's leading." Edward rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of responsibility. "And the people? How are they reacting to all this?" "There's unrest," Martha admitted. "Some are relieved the conspiracy has been uncovered, but many are shocked and distrustful. Years of trust were shattered in a matter of days." "Understandable," murmured Edward. He stood and walked over to the window that looked out over the palace gardens. Outside, life appeared to go on as usual, but he knew that beneath the surface, Ardenton was in turmoil. "We need to do more than just punish the guilty," he said, turning back to his companions. "We have to rebuild the people's trust in their institutions." At that moment, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Princess Eleanor. Her face showed signs of exhaustion, but her eyes shone with determination. "Good morning, everyone," she said, taking a seat. "I have important news. The king wishes to make a public address regarding recent events." A tense silence fell over the room. The king, who had been notably absent throughout the crisis, was finally going to speak. "This is unexpected," Edward said carefully. The princess nodded. "My brother understands the gravity of the situation. He wants to reassure the people and show that the monarchy stands united in the pursuit of justice and reform." "And what will be his message, Your Highness?" Martha asked. "Transparency and renewal," Eleanor replied. "The king will announce a series of comprehensive reforms, greater oversight of royal councils, regular audits, and a new system of checks and balances to prevent future abuses of power." Edward felt a mix of relief and apprehension. These were long overdue changes, but implementing them would not be easy. "There will be resistance," he cautioned. "Many in the nobility and bureaucracy will see this as a threat to the status quo." "Undoubtedly," agreed the princess. "That's why we need you. Your integrity and courage brought us this far. Now, we need your wisdom and dedication to guide Ardenton through this transition." The following hours were spent in intense planning. Strategies were devised, decrees drafted, and a vision for a new Ardenton began to take shape. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the palace corridors, Edward found himself alone in his office once more. He gazed out at the city beyond the windows, the lights beginning to twinkle in the twilight. The question that had tormented him throughout the day echoed in his mind. How do you rebuild a kingdom shaken by betrayal and doubt? The answer, he now realized, would not come from any single person or action. It would be a collective effort, a daily commitment from every citizen of Ardenton to rebuild, reform, and renew. Edward picked up his pen and began to write. The king's speech would be just the beginning. The real work, the work of healing wounds, restoring trust, and forging a new path for Ardenton, was only just beginning. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Edward felt, for the first time in weeks, a spark of true hope. Ardenton had faced its greatest crisis and survived. Now, with courage, integrity, and determination, they would build a brighter and more just future for everyone. How do you balance vigilance and hope when the shadows of the past threaten to darken the light of the future? The months that followed the revelation of Lord Hawke's letter were tense and frenetic. The special team formed by Edward, under Princess Eleanor's direct supervision, worked tirelessly, investigating every lead, every con. One particularly hectic morning, Edward found himself in a secret meeting with key members of his team. The location was a hidden room in the palace's underground chambers, known to only a few and protected against any eavesdropping. "What do we have so far?" Edward asked, looking at the weary faces around him. Martha, who headed the financial investigation team, spoke first. "We found evidence of suspicious transactions involving shell companies in at least 3 neighboring kingdoms. The pattern is consistent with what we saw in Hawke's operation here in Ardenton." Charles, responsible for intelligence and counterintelligence, added, "In addition, we've identified several individuals in positions of power in these kingdoms who have questionable connections. Some of them visited Ardenton in the months leading up to Hawke's attempted coup." Edward absorbed the information, feeling the weight of the situation. So, Hawke was telling the truth. The conspiracy reaches far beyond Princess Eleanor, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "This puts Ardenton in a delicate position. If we act openly, we could trigger a diplomatic crisis, but if we do nothing, we risk allowing this network to continue operating." A heavy silence filled the room as everyone considered the implications. Edward stood up and walked to a map on the wall, which showed Ardenton and the neighboring kingdoms. "We need more information," he said finally, turning to face the group. "We can't risk accusing anyone without irrefutable evidence. At the same time, we can't stand by while this threat grows in the shadows." "What do you suggest, Edward?" the princess asked. Edward looked at them, determination on his face. "A large-scale intelligence operation. We need to infiltrate agents into the suspect kingdoms, gather indisputable evidence, and, if possible, identify potential allies who can help us dismantle this network from within." Charles nodded slowly. "It's risky, but I have a few agents in mind who would be perfect for this mission." "And what about Hawke?" asked Martha. "He may still hold valuable information." Edward exchanged a look with the princess before responding. "We'll continue to interrogate him, but with caution. We can't fully trust him, but we also can't ignore what he knows." The next few hours were spent meticulously planning the operation. Agents were selected, secure communication routes were established, and a carefully crafted strategy was developed to navigate the delicate diplomatic terrain ahead. When the meeting finally ended, it was already late at night. Edward found himself alone with Princess Eleanor, both exhausted but resolute. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we?" Edward asked, a rare note of uncertainty in his voice. The princess placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're doing what's necessary, Edward, to protect not only Ardenton, but all the kingdoms that could fall victim to this conspiracy." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a glimmer of hope. As they walked back to the upper levels of the palace, he couldn't help but reflect on the question that had haunted him. How do you balance vigilance and hope when the shadows of the past threaten to darken the light of the future? The answer, he now realized, lay in action. In the courage to confront the shadows, not with fear but with determination. In the wisdom to seek the truth even when it was inconvenient, and in the hope that through their efforts, a better future could be forged. As the first light of dawn began to tinge the sky, Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but he was ready to face it. With loyal allies by his side and the strength of his convictions to guide him, Edward knew they would face whatever challenges the future might bring. The fight for truth and justice continued, and Ardenton stood at the forefront of that battle. The next chapter in the kingdom's story was about to be written, and Edward was determined to ensure it would be one of courage, integrity, and unshakable hope. How do you weave a future of hope from the fragile threads of truth in a world of shadows? The months that followed were a delicate dance between shadows and light for Edward and his team. The large-scale intelligence operation, codenamed Spiderweb, was in full swing. Agents from Ardenton, carefully selected and trained, infiltrated neighboring kingdoms, gathering valuable information and weaving a network of cautious allies. One autumn afternoon, Edward was in his office studying the latest reports when Martha entered, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Edward," she said, quietly closing the door behind her. "We have a major discovery." He looked up, instantly alert. "What did you find?" Martha placed a dossier on the table. "We've managed to identify the core of Hawke's network in the neighboring kingdoms. It's bigger and more influential than we imagined." Edward opened the dossier, his eyes quickly scanning its contents. The names of prominent figures, ministers, generals, even members of royal families, leapt off the pages, each connected by lines of corruption and conspiracy. "This is overwhelming," he murmured. At that moment, Charles entered the office, followed closely by Princess Eleanor. "You've already seen it?" Charles asked, catching his breath. Edward nodded grimly. "I've just been informed. This changes everything." The princess. "With this information, we can no longer delay action, but we also can't simply accuse leaders of allied nations without irrefutable proof." "And there's more," Charles continued. "Our agents discovered plans for a secret meeting. Representatives from across Hawke's network, including some we haven't yet identified, plan to meet on neutral territory in a month." A tense silence filled the room as everyone absorbed the implications. This could be their only chance to expose the entire conspiracy. Edward stood and walked to the window. Outside, the autumn leaves danced in the wind, oblivious to the drama unfolding within the palace. "We have to act," he finally said, turning to the group. "But we can't do this alone. We need allies, both here in Ardenton and in the neighboring kingdoms." The princess nodded. "I agree. But who can we trust with information this sensitive?" "I have an idea," said Martha, her face lighting up. "During our investigations, we identified several individuals in positions of power who resisted Hawke's network's attempts at corruption. They could be our natural allies." Edward felt a glimmer of hope. "Excellent, Martha. Charles, can you discreetly reach out to these potential allies?" Charles nodded. "Consider it done. I'll use our most secure channels." The next few hours were a whirlwind of planning and strategy. A complex operation began to take shape, one that, if successful, would not only expose the conspiracy, but also forge new alliances between kingdoms built on integrity and mutual trust. When night fell, Edward once again found himself alone in his office. He looked out over the city, watching the lights flicker like earthly stars. The question echoed in his mind: how do you weave a future of hope from the fragile threads of truth in a world of shadows? The answer, he now realized, lay in the courage of those who dared to believe in a better future. In the small and large acts of integrity that together formed a tapestry of change. Edward picked up his pen and began to write. A letter to each of the potential allies identified in the neighboring kingdoms. Carefully chosen words of hope, courage, and a call to action. As he wrote, Edward felt a renewed determination. The path ahead would be perilous, full of traps and uncertainties. But for the first time since this journey began, he saw a clear path to victory. It wouldn't be easy. It would require sacrifice, courage, and an unshakable faith in people's ability to choose what is right when faced with the truth. But it was possible. As the sun rose over Ardenton the next day, it found Edward still at his desk, the first light illuminating a stack of sealed letters, each one a thread of hope cast into the darkness, ready to weave a new future. When the last thread is woven, what pattern emerges from the tapestry of our choices? A year had passed since that fateful night when Edward sent his letters of hope. Autumn had returned to Ardenton, painting the city in shades of gold and red, as if nature itself celebrated the changes that had taken place. Edward stood on the balcony of the royal palace, overlooking the city below. Beside him was Princess Eleanor, now Queen Eleanor, following her brother's abdication. Together they watched the same scene, reflecting on the events that had brought them to this moment. "It feels like a lifetime ago," murmured Eleanor, her voice filled with restrained emotion. Edward nodded, recalling the tumultuous events of the past year. The secret meeting of Hawke's network had been intercepted by a coalition of loyal forces from various kingdoms, each answering the call for integrity and justice. The operation, codenamed Aurora, had been a success beyond their most optimistic expectations. Not only was the conspiracy exposed and dismantled, But the process had also forged unbreakable bonds between the kingdoms that chose to unite against corruption. "There's still much work ahead," Edward said, turning to face the Queen. "But for the first time in a long while, I feel that we are truly on the right path." Eleanor smiled, a rare expression that brightened her normally serious face. "Thanks to you, Edward. Your courage and integrity have brought us to this point." Edward felt his face flush. "It was a joint effort, Your Majesty. Every person who chose truth over the comfort of ignorance, every ally who risked everything for justice, they are the true heroes of this story." At that moment, Martha and Charles joined them on the balcony, each carrying a folder. "These are the final reports, sir," said Charles, handing his folder to Edward. Martha added, placing hers on a nearby table, "and the final proposals for inter-kingdom reforms." Edward opened the first folder, his eyes quickly scanning its contents. "It seems that the last cells of Hawke's network have been neutralized," he announced, a note of relief in his voice. "And Hawke?" Eleanor asked. "Still imprisoned," replied Charles, "but cooperative. His information has been invaluable in ensuring we leave no stone unturned." Edward turned to the second folder, containing the reform proposals. As he read through them, a slow smile spread across his face. "This is remarkable," he said, looking at his companions. "Our treaty of cooperation and transparency among all the affected kingdoms. Fair trade, cultural exchange, mutual defense against corruption and tyranny." "It's more than just a treaty," said Eleanor, her voice filled with pride. "It's a new era, one based on trust, integrity, and shared hope." The four stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what they had achieved and what lay ahead. "So," Martha finally asked, "what happens now?" Edward looked once more at the city, at the citizens going about their lives, unaware that the world around them had fundamentally changed for the better. "Now," he said, his voice firm and filled with purpose, "we continue the work. We build on the foundations we've laid. We ensure that the lessons learned are never forgotten and that the changes we've made endure." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "And we always remember that vigilance is the price of freedom, that each generation must do its part to protect and nurture what we've built here." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over Ardenton, Edward reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Every choice, every act of courage, every moment of doubt and triumph, all were threads in the grand tapestry of fate. The final question echoed in his mind. When the last thread is woven, what pattern emerges from the tapestry of our choices? Looking at his companions, at the city beyond, and at the future that lay before them, Edward saw the answer clearly. The pattern that emerged was one of hope, of integrity triumphing over corruption, of light breaking through even the deepest shadows. It was an imperfect pattern, with its own challenges and struggles to come. But it was one of progress, of people united by a common purpose, weaving together a better future. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Edward knew with a certainty that came from the depths of his soul that no matter what challenges the future might bring, Ardenton and its allies would face them together, guided by the light of truth and the unbreakable strength of hope. When the shadows of the past threaten to eclipse the future, how do you ensure the light shines through? The following months were a series of hard-won victories, but with each success, a new challenge awaited. Yet Ardenton had shifted from merely surviving its trials to emerging stronger from them. The reforms they'd enacted required constant oversight, as both old adversaries and fresh power seekers threatened to exploit the kingdom's vulnerability. Edward, now officially appointed as chief advisor, worked tirelessly, along with Queen Eleanor and his closest allies, to ensure these changes would be lasting. As seasons changed and Ardenton flourished under its new leadership, Edward realized that his journey and that of the kingdom had only begun. The tapestry of their choices, woven with courage, sacrifice, and boundless hope, would serve as a guide for the future generations of Ardenton. With unyielding vigilance and a spirit of unity, Ardenton would stand as a beacon of resilience, ensuring that no matter how dark the shadows might grow, the light of integrity and justice would always shine through.